This is Politics Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. Emily Brooks is a writer at The Hill, a newspaper that covers Congress very closely. Before this, she wrote at the Washington Examiner, and she's an expert on all things having to do with Republicans in Congress, and specifically, Republicans in the House. As a reporter, Emily is there at the Capitol and has a right to ask members anything she wants to as they walk through the halls, at lunch, or in the press conferences they hold. Throughout this process, she gets to know a lot of them personally. They open up to her and share things, sometimes things that they might not be willing to say publicly, but that they feel should be said publicly, or at least printed publicly. This is a uniquely accessible part of our legislative system, and as someone who's there on the front lines, we talked with Emily about what's really going on in the House Republican caucus these days, and what her crystal ball prediction is for what Republicans will actually do if they win back the House in this November's election. As a reminder, like all of our episodes, this is an edited version of a longer conversation that was taped live with audience questions. For information on how to join us, our upcoming schedule, and past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode this Friday, featuring Victor Cha, who's the Korea chair at CSIS and someone with a lot of experience advising U.S. presidents and leading negotiations on the U.S.'s behalf abroad. Our co-founders Justin Higgins and John Gunnison led this interview. For the first question, John was asking about the Republican leader, Kevin McCarthy. Recently, it was reported that in the days after January 6th, McCarthy told other Republicans that he thought Trump should resign because he was so appalled that a U.S. president would literally try to attack Congress and overthrow an election. After this news report came out, McCarthy, of course, denied it and pledged his loyalty to Trump. His response was literally to brag about how many times he had spoken to Trump that day. Of course, a tape did come out literally saying that he thought Donald Trump should resign and planned to tell him so. He was caught in the lie. And now within the Republican Party, there's something of a conversation about whether he's pure of heart enough to be Speaker if Republicans take back the House. When we started out the conversation, John was asking Emily about what House Republican members are actually saying in private about the whole episode. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
So I want to ask you, Emily, because you are speaking to members and staff, what are you actually hearing in private from members as they react to this McCarthy audio?
I think a lot of how they really feel is a lot of how they are responding publicly, that they just kind of would like a lot of the questions about Leader McCarthy's political future and a lot of the questions about the past, about January 6th and President Trump to kind of go away so they can focus on winning the House majority and view a whole lot of this as a bit of a distraction. There are a couple of members on the sort of far right portion of the House, some Freedom Caucus members. A couple of them have been pretty vocal, including Representative Matt Gaetz and Representative Andy Biggs, being critical of Leader McCarthy for kind of musing about whether more members should be kicked off of Twitter, which is in contrast with a lot of the messaging from Republicans. A lot of them are in private have said that, okay, well, Leader McCarthy did get caught in a lie. I think that's the portion that if you're not sort of in the more right-wing Freedom Caucus part, it looks maybe a little bit embarrassing and isn't really great to have a leader being caught saying a falsehood, but they're willing to accept his explanation that he thought he was being asked something else than he actually was, and willing to go along with that. And he's been known to speak to whatever audience he has at the current time and sort of moderate his tone based off of that.
So, Emily, we had one of those members on, Congresswoman Nancy Mace, who's not in the Freedom Caucus. And I don't want to put words in her mouth, but my takeaway was she supports McCarthy because McCarthy supports her. And McCarthy was in the House during the coup, the successful coup that took Boehner down. And while people like my former boss, Tim Huelskamp, argued it's all ideology, and Jim Jordan argued it's all ideology, I'm going to call BS on that. And I think it was just that Boehner didn't have good interpersonal relations with these people. He tried to snuff out the Freedom Caucus. and kicked people off of committees and more primary issues, didn't give people like Jim Jordan committee seats they wanted. So what has Kevin McCarthy, if anything, learned from the way that Boehner managed the caucus that resulted in him having to ultimately resign for the way that McCarthy has approached the caucus prior to this incident?
Yeah, I think a couple of weeks ago, Republicans had their House leadership retreat, and I'll have to look up exactly what he said, but he alluded to Speaker Boehner and his ouster. And he said, I think, something along the lines of, I learned a lot from watching that. And you can see, around that time, Jim Jordan was a rabble rouser, member of the Freedom Caucus without a lot of political power. Now he is a ranking member on the House Judiciary Committee and aiming for that Speaker's gavel or Chairman gavel, and has said that he supports Leader McCarthy. And so things have definitely changed. Leader McCarthy is certainly making room for a lot of these more loud and sometimes extreme members to have their space and not come out explicitly against them. In some cases, like in Jim Jordan's case, give them actual powers on committees and certain assignments and sort of shoring up that support. And that's a very, different approach than what John Boehner was doing.
So, Emily, I'd like to ask you about a figure that you were describing earlier, and that's Jim Jordan. And you were talking about his relationship with McCarthy and how he's been able to get concessions from McCarthy to elevate his own position inside the House caucus. So, do you get the feeling that Jordan would be very happy to get a chairmanship, maybe the judiciary chairmanship? Or do you think that he does have higher ambitions, that he might be interested in maybe challenging for the speakership? What do you think is his priority and his sense of direction right now?
He has tried to run for House Speaker in the past. It was a bit of a protest against some other candidates. But right now, he is just laser focused on getting the Judiciary Committee chairmanship. He has said that he supports Leader McCarthy to be Speaker and Scalise to be Majority Leader. And he hasn't expressed in months, maybe even more than a year or further, publicly at least, or privately, to me, any interest in running for House Speaker. And so I'm not sure if he just thinks he can make a bigger splash and do more things with the investigatory powers that come from a Judiciary Committee gavel. But that certainly seems to be the direction that he's going right now.
So, as you alluded, Emily, the last time that Jim Jordan ran for Speaker, it was kind of a protest. He didn't really have a tangible chance of becoming the House Speaker at the time. But the political contours of the country and also of the caucus have changed since then. So, I want to get an idea from you about how you think the current math breaks down in the caucus, how you see the sizes of these factions. If there was a challenger to McCarthy, how large do you think that faction is today, and how large do you think the support for McCarthy might be?
The math and how it breaks down will really depend on how many seats that Republicans win, assuming they win the majority, and how big that majority is. And so there's one line of thinking that if Republicans have a massive wave, it's almost a record or it's close to a record number of seats, then that shows that McCarthy has been successful and people will be more unified behind him. Another line of thinking is that if there are that many members, then that gives more leeway to have more protest votes for somebody else without actually risking that Democrats, whoever they coalesce behind in that vote, would actually win, because Republicans are not going to do that. That math is going to be predetermined ahead of time to ensure that a Republican is in that spot. So that kind of depends. And so if it's a narrower majority, one idea is, Leader McCarthy did not do as good of a job in leading the conference, and House leadership didn't do as good of a job of leading the conference. And so he doesn't really deserve that spot. And so that could prompt some more protest votes for somebody else. But then another line of thought is, well, if it's so that close, you really don't want to risk actually messing everything up. And so that could prompt the conference to coalesce more around McCarthy to make sure that he is seen as the speaker that Republicans actually do want, and make sure that Republicans do have sort of that authority and control over that House.
But Jim Jordan also has an interesting past. From 1986 to 1994, Jordan was an assistant wrestling coach at Ohio State University. And while he was on that coaching staff, the team doctor, a guy named Richard Strauss, sexually abused at least 177 male students, according to an independent investigation conducted by law firm Perkins Coie. Now, the investigation was commissioned after a whistleblower came forward to say he was victimized, a former Ohio State wrestler named Mike DiSabato. Other former students have joined him, and 350 students have now filed suit against the university. Now, the whistleblower and numerous other former wrestlers say that at the time, they told Jim Jordan, among others, what was going on. And they say Jim Jordan turned a blind eye to the systematic sexual abuse happening right under his nose. That claim is backed up by that same independent investigation, which found the abuse was, and I quote it here, open secret, including among the coaching staff. That whistleblower telling NBC News, quote, I consider Jim Jordan a friend, but at the end of the day, he is absolutely lying if he says he doesn't know what was going on. At a public hearing on Tuesday, that whistleblower...
Emily, let me just ask you one more thing that has to do with what we've just been talking about Jim Jordan and how McCarthy has tried to cultivate relationships with figures like Jordan and elevate them. The thing about Jim Jordan that I think it's hard to get past is that, frankly, he's quite an unappealing public figure, that he does not necessarily inspire warmth among the public who might be seeing him on television or listening to him. And he also has ties to these various scandals, like the scandal at, I believe it was Ohio State University, where he was a wrestling coach who appears to have helped cover up for abusers. And because of his lack of charisma and his rather unappealing nature, I wonder if McCarthy and the rest of leadership are a little bit cautious about putting him in these very elevated public positions. For example, during the impeachment hearings, when they gave him spots on all of these committees that he wasn't ordinarily part of, to put him on television. Do they worry that elevating the public profile of someone like Jim Jordan is very counterproductive politically? Because I imagine many people listen or hear Jordan and they just think, whatever that gentleman is saying, I'm on the other side.
I don't think that they are particularly worried. Congressman Jordan, whenever I've spoken to him, is exceedingly on message with talking points and knows what he's going to say. And he's known for not doing any interview that he doesn't want to do. He tends to stick to only conservative outlets and conservative media. And he's very intentional with things like that. So as far as being worried about what he's going to say, I think that he's on the lower end of the list of members that they might worry about. You know, he's gotten a lot of buy-in with some of his investigatory groundwork laying projects that he's doing right now. I mean, the House Judiciary Committee Republicans right now have asked for a lot. They're trying to probe the whole Hunter Biden laptop story that the New York Post wrote and then was censored from Twitter and then reduced distribution on Facebook. And all, they're looking into that right now and laying the groundwork for subpoenas if they win the majority relating to that issue. And I see the same messages coming from the House Republican Conference about that. So they've been pretty much in line. And he is on a lot of conservative media. He's on Fox News very frequently. But I think that the lack of worry about something like that is a little bit a part of the story of the Republican Party and politics in general and redistricting in general. Like there's so few swing districts anymore, or they're shrinking. The number of swing districts is shrinking. And that means that the real battle for control and who is going to be actually in Congress in most districts will play out in the primaries. And when you're trying to get elected in primary, you generally have a more engaged and conservative Republican base of voters. And that's a lot of times who they're playing to rather than sort of those swing state voters, especially with a lot of these things that get into the weeds and what people are doing in congressional investigations, like with the Hunter Biden laptop or other things like that. So I have not seen concern about him specifically, no.
So I have experience working for the Freedom Caucus when Jordan was one of the leaders. And while I don't agree with his politics or the way he goes about it, I think he's a phenomenal politician for the era that we're in that he's the type of fighter. Naturally, he's that type of fighter that Donald Trump is, that in a lot of ways Ron DeSantis is, and that everybody else is trying to almost emulate. So following up on that, do you think that one of the reasons why McCarthy and others may be willing to trust Jordan so much is that he does represent that anger in the base? And not only that, but he can kind of stir up the base to get out there and vote.
Yeah, I definitely think that. And I think that's one of the reasons why he was elevated to his position that he's in now. And one of the larger shifts in the Republican Party since the Trump era, since 2016, is that the base voters are really looking for somebody, not necessarily who they agree with on every single thing or has a squeaky clean record or is free of scandal in general, but somebody who they think can go out there and fight for them and show it like they're sticking it to the Democrats or investigating the Biden administration or investigating Democrats' political scandals and kind of showing that muscle. And so, in a different way than Trump, but also in his own way, Jim Jordan is showing that he's trying to do that, especially if he has some subpoena powers next year.
So, Emily, I want you to speculate with us a little bit. For me, there were two stories, right, with the McCarthy tapes. One, he wasn't telling the truth. Two, who the heck leaked those tapes? It was a very small, I mean, you had staffers on there. And when I talk about staffers, I view them as extensions of their boss in this instance. So maybe take your journalism hat off. We're not asking for sources, but one of the theories out there is that they could have been leaked by Elise Stefanik because there's a lot of rumors about her and her intentions and going from a very, 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 very moderate, one of the more respected moderates in the GOP caucus to extremely Trumpy. Do you think that theory has any legs?
Well, I will say that who leaked these tapes is the talk of Republican staff on Capitol Hill right now. Everyone's trying to figure out who leaked the tapes. So about Elise Stefanik, the thing that doesn't make sense to me about that is that she was not in leadership at that time. This was a January 10th, 2021 call, probably like a handful of members on that call, McCarthy, Scalise, Liz Cheney, and Tom Emmer, maybe one or two others, and their staffs or some top members of their staff. And
like chief of staff for everybody in the audience.
Yes. So one question is, how would she even have gotten that audio? Perhaps Republican conference calls or meetings are recorded and stored in some place. I'm not sure if this one was or not, but it doesn't add up to me because I'm not completely discounting it, but that doesn't add up to me because I don't know how she would have gotten a hold of the audio to even leak it.
It doesn't make sense, right? But we had to ask. I think that that's just people trying to attack her character. Before John asks you the next question, my bet, Emily, and this is from being a mid-level staffer during the last leadership coup that was successful based on my understandings of the machinations, I'm going to guess it was Steve Scalise because this is something right up his alley. But John, over to you.
Well, I will say that Steve Scalise staff or Steve Scalise spokeswoman put out a statement saying that it was not him or any members of his staff, which is interesting.
Because she knows that, right?
And slightly different than Representative Liz Cheney's staff, who put out a statement that she did not put out the audio and was not aware of how it got out, but did not specifically mention staff.
It's funny that those statements would be seen to have any value, right? Because the whole lesson of this entire episode is that public statements by these figures in GOP leadership are not very valuable, right? What the scandal here is that McCarthy put out a statement which was clearly factually disproven by the audio itself. So why would any more statements about this audio from any of them really mean anything?
Well, yeah, as a reporter, I really hope that when there are some specific statements like that, that it means something and that it's truthful. And even if there is some spin to it, it's not outright actually false and the lie. Obviously, as we all know, that's now because of this McCarthy tapes, it's not actually always the case.
Well, let me ask you then something else about Scalise, because we're really kind of going through the big figures in leadership kind of one by one. And we were just talking about Scalise. So I'm a little bit curious about how he fits into this, because in the press, he's often been depicted as the more conservative, maybe even more right-wing member of the leadership team. But it also seems as though his relationship with these bomb-throwing right-wing members is very bad, maybe even worse than the relationship that the other people in leadership have with that Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz group. And this is especially apparent in the way that Scalise has been interacting with Matt Gaetz. That there was a story that these two gentlemen had a meeting where they were very much at odds with each other. And there seems to be maybe a history between Gaetz and Scalise, or the other members of this faction of the caucus and Scalise. So could you tell us a little bit about that? How does Scalise interact with those kinds of members? And is there a history of animosity between him and that group?
Steve Scalise was previously the chairman of the Republican Study Committee, which is the largest conservative caucus in the House, but is a little bit different than the Freedom Caucus in that it's really focused a lot more on policy and ideas and trying to come up with those things rather than the Freedom Caucus, which is these days a lot more focused on tactics and being confrontational. There are a lot of, new Republicans. All they known was what Washington and Congress was like underneath Trump. A lot of them are more inclined to this new right type of vision of economics where they're thinking, well, it's good to implement, they're kind of more open to more populist economic policies than some of the more traditional kind of heritage foundation like conservatives. So that's a major divide between some Republicans right now. So he's definitely more of the traditional type, and he's not really a bomb thrower.
You reported, and others had it too, that there's the potential of the House GOP impeaching Mayorkas, Secretary Mayorkas of DHS, over not doing the border policies that they want. So I kind of wanted to take a different angle on this question. It seems like McCarthy is going to be largely indebted to not only Jim Jordan and others that are more firebrandy and confrontational, but also President Trump. If they do decide to impeach Mayorkas, how far do you think McCarthy is willing to go down that path to keep his speakership? Let's say they do impeach Mayorkas. Let's say it doesn't satiate Trump. Do you think McCarthy's the type of guy to maybe impeach Biden when there isn't something inherently to impeach him on other than Donald Trump and the more conservative wing wanting Biden impeached?
Leader McCarthy said in an interview at their Republican retreat that his standard for, I think that was at the Republican retreat, but he did say recently that his standard for impeachment was a violation of the law. So this is sort of what he has been inching towards with Mayorkas, saying that he's not enforcing the law, he's violating the law, he's violating his constitutional duty. Those are the type of arguments that we're hearing from Republicans regarding the border issue. And it is also a bit different because this is an issue that Republicans have really been hammering on. Freedom Caucus members have really been going very hard on that issue, and Republicans are, using it in their campaigns, and they might, if they do win the House, they might credit calling for more border enforcement or border issues, they might point to that as one of the reasons why they did win. So I think that Mayorkas is more, I'm not sure if it will go that far yet, but Mayorkas seems to be in a special case among a lot of the Biden cabinet officials. Another possibility that is one of the more criticized officials among Republicans is Secretary Blinken and the State Department. And that's largely due to the handling of the Afghanistan withdrawal and matters related to that. I don't know if they're arguing that he violated the law in his handling of that, but Republicans have promised, more investigations into that matter if and when they do win the majority. And so that could be a possibility. I would only think about the Biden officials who have been kind of overseeing the kind of cabinet departments relating to a lot of the issues they are talking about most. And I don't know. We haven't really heard about the education secretary. I don't know how far that would go, but for Biden, it would really have to be something. I'm not sure. I mean, that's the big question, something tangible that they could hold on to. And would they want to impeach him when they've argued that it was a political impeachment for President Trump twice? I'm not sure about that.
Republicans seek to take control of the House of Representatives in the 2022 midterm elections. National Republican Congressional Committee Chairman Tom Emmer says the party has to remain focused on two things: the importance of economic freedoms and the dangers of big government. So what is the Republican strategy for trying to win back the House, and what are the issues that they think will most resonate with voters?
We're talking about the GOP plans for when they expect to retake the House majority, who might be in leadership, the investigations, or even impeachment proceedings they might pursue. But I think that when we talk about how Congress is going to operate and what their plans are, we really need to start with policy, right? What do you see as the GOP agenda legislatively if they do, in fact, retake the House? We know that they're going to campaign on many of the genuine problems in the economy right now: inflation, supply chain issues, the energy prices. What are some of the ways in which they hope to actually address those problems that might help them retake the House when they have the power to legislate on those matters?
They've promised an avalanche of investigative measures into the origins of the coronavirus pandemic. They've talked a lot about the Department of Justice and their relationship with the National School Boards Association and viewing teachers. There was a letter that referred to parents speaking up at school board meetings or making threats against actual school board members and threats of violence and school officials, and sort of investigating that. They've mentioned a couple of things that they are rolling out and plan to do. They have a bill called the Parents' Bill of Rights, which kind of addresses those hot button education issues that would require school districts to post curriculum publicly and do a number of other things like requiring teachers to offer in-person meetings to parents. And they're promising to take on big tech, but exactly how that is going to happen is a little bit up in the air. And they're still kind of coming towards, they have some draft bills regarding that. But they are very focused on trying to put out a plan, unlike Leader Mitch McConnell in the Senate, who has said that he doesn't really want to put out a plan. And then when Senator Rick Scott of Florida put out his Rescue America plan that included a little bit about, we need to make sure that everybody's invested into the system, and so everybody should pay taxes, even though 50% of people don't pay federal income taxes. And that prompted a whole wave of Democratic attacks. To McConnell, that was, here is exactly why we're not going to put out this plan. But Republicans in the House have a very different approach and idea. They are planning a sort of Newt Gingrich Contract with America style plan that they will release in probably late summer, right before election season, called the Commitment to America. And they've sort of had a version of that in the previous election cycle, but this is going to be a little bit different, and they're still kind of working out the specifics of what they're going to put in there. But those are the kind of policy positions that they've made public so far.
Well, when we had the exact inverse, when we had the Democratic House, the Republican White House and Senate, we got some significant things passed. Like there was the USMCA, and then there was the CARES Act. Of course, not all of that was perceived going into the election, but certainly big things can be achieved. Not will, but can be achieved when you've got divided government. We'll see what happens. Maybe some tech antitrust stuff. We'll see. We're going to go to the audience.
We will go to Shanette and then Ken.
Thanks so much, John and Justin. And Emily, thank you. This has been fantastic. My question relates to the January 6th committee. I know McCarthy was given the opportunity to seat people on that committee, and Nancy Pelosi didn't allow for, I don't remember all, I know Jim Jordan was one, but there were some that she said absolutely cannot be seated. But there were people who McCarthy had put forward to be on there. Do you think his decision to say, no, I'm taking my ball and going home and not going to seat anyone if you're not going to seat all the folks that I put forward, so therefore he has no allies in the room, will ultimately backfire on him? I'd love to get your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, and one that Republicans don't ever really want to address because I think that there are ways that you can see tangibly that it has backfired on them. And not just the January 6th House Select Committee, but Republicans not agreeing to a bipartisan, bicameral commission that would have included members from the Senate as well. And the Senate shot that down. Senate Republicans shot that down. That proposal, while there were problems, and McCarthy did have some issues with Speaker Pelosi for a long time on the original proposals that were floating around sort of shortly after January 6th. But the commission, the bipartisan bicameral commission, would have had an end date for when they had to wrap up and deliver a report, and it would have wrapped up at the end of 2021. So it wouldn't have really interfered with the election year and the campaign season, which is exactly what this commission is doing right now. Another way that this has frustrated Republicans who could have been on the committee, and the other one who was removed by Speaker Pelosi was Jim Banks, who is a name to keep an eye on. He has been in the media a lot, seems to be apparently climbing the ranks of leadership. He is currently the head of the Republican Study Committee right now. And they've been very frustrated that in these depositions and in these interviews that the committee is having with people that they've called forth to speak to them is that, well, you have Representative Cheney, who they don't see as an ally anymore, who's the vice chair of the committee. And they have all the Democratic staff on the committee. And so they have some lawyers who are aligned with Representative Cheney. They have lawyers who are Democratic lawyers. And when you're in that room, there's no Republican lawyer who is asking people these questions or being able to push back on the Democrats. And so that's something that's frustrated them. But that's, as you mentioned, sort of a self-created problem, because Leader McCarthy did make the decision to pull all of his members from the committee and have no Republicans there and not appoint Republican staff. And so I think that has backfired in that sense, and it's kept members in the headlines.
We're going to go to Ken.
Yeah, thank you. The members who are just kind of like more serious about their work, regardless of their ideology, how do they look at, these handful of members who are getting all sorts of publicity for just, saying wild things or doing wild things? And is that like a deterrent of them staying in Congress? And to what extent, because there have been a lot of retirements, then when we're done with looking at all the retirements and open seats, can we get a House where there's enough new Republicans, okay, even if the seats stay Republican, that there is a leadership change because you have that much infusion of new blood and nobody knows how they're going to vote?
To that last point you made, I was talking to a member of Congress yesterday who kind of put it in a funny way. And he said that when you're first elected and you know you've won your election to Congress for the very first time, you are the smartest person ever. And you made it and you overcome all the obstacles and got to win the election, won the primary, won the election, got this far. And then you get inaugurated. And then certainly you are the dumbest person in the room because you don't know how it works and you don't know you don't necessarily know the process or the culture unless, there are a number of members of Congress who have been former congressional staffers. And so they might know a little bit more. So I think that they are in a position, a lot of the newer members, to be guided more by leadership, or even if they're not inclined to necessarily agree with Leader McCarthy and they're more inclined to something like the Freedom Caucus or something like that, take some tips from them. Another thought I've heard brought up, but I'm not sure how convinced I am about this, is that once you have a fair number of, you might have like close to 50% of Republicans next year who have been elected either in 2016 or after. And so they're kind of like the Trump era Republicans, and that might change the face of the party. I don't know if that in itself, though, is really enough to change things. In Congress, you have the kind of members, they always say, oh, well, you're a show horse or you're a workhorse. And so you have those members. And this has been not just for the current era of the last couple of years, but for a very long time, you have the people who are more inclined towards media and are very good at making their talking points and delivering a message. And then a lot of those members who are not really as inclined towards that or doing that, but they're really good on policy and they're really good at moving up the ranks, and they, enjoy exerting power in maybe less visible media centric ways. And so I think it kind of depends on their personalities. Some of them I know absolutely do get annoyed with some of the other members, but a lot of times those members who are making a lot of noise are not the ones who are holding the gavel for the committee or making the actual policy decisions. And so I think that they tolerate it based off of being in the majority and being able to make those decisions.
Emily, it's such a dumb saying, show horse, workhorse, but I also love it, and it's pretty accurate, right?
Oh yeah, it is. And then if you can get somebody, who's both, then then you're a real star.
I wanted to give you an opportunity to give us your last thoughts. It could be about primary season. It could be about your role covering the House and specifically the GOP. It could be what the future holds. Anything else that I didn't mention? What are your last thoughts, whether they're positive, negative, or somewhere in between?
Yeah, I'm always interested in how the Republican Party is evolving in terms of sort of their ideology and style. And a lot of times that's reflected a lot more in the House of Representatives than it is in the Senate. So as we go into election season this year, I'm looking forward to seeing which primaries are. I'm not covering campaigns as closely, but it will affect my work next year. So I'm interested to see which primaries, the more loud, bombastic types of confrontational people, win those versus some other more reserved members. There has been one interesting primary in Texas so far, where Congressman Dan Crenshaw had endorsed Morgan Luttrell, and then a number of other Republicans, including Ted Cruz, were backing Christian Collins, who is, a little bit more of that vein. And Dan Crenshaw's candidate won. So we'll see. And I'm very interested to see the influence of President Trump if in some of these open primaries, which candidates he does endorse, and if his endorsements are successful. They have not always been in the past, but he is certainly endorsing a lot of members right now, a lot of which don't really have any competitive races, but there are going to be a couple of interesting primary challenges, not only primary challenges, but just primary battles and open seats. And of course, which of those challengers to members who voted to impeach Trump do end up winning or not. So I think that'll say a lot about the character of the Republican Party as a whole and the House and how leaders manage that next year based on how those play out.
That concludes our conversation for today. Again, huge thanks to Emily Brooks, to The Hill, to our audience for their questions, and most importantly, to you for being here. Like all of our episodes, this is an edited version of a longer conversation that was taped live with audience questions. For information about how to join us, our upcoming schedule, and past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode this Friday featuring Victor Cha, who's the Korea chair at CSIS, and who's someone with a lot of experience advising U.S. presidents and leading negotiations on the U.S.'s behalf abroad. This has been Politics and Media 101, produced in partnership with Clubhouse. Wherever you are in the world, thank you for being a part of this community. I'm Jeff Browning on behalf of Justin Higgins and John Gunnison, our co-founders. We hope to hear from you soon.